Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our monthly webinar, the July 18th, 2019 version of the webinar. It is 1 o'clock. We will wait another minute or two here and to allow a few last people to get on, and then we will start with Stuart Foster from Kentucky. Okay, once again, welcome everyone to the July 18th, 2019 North Central U.S. Climate and Drought Outlook webinar. Welcome to everyone. We're in the middle of a fairly warm stretch for most of our attendees, with a big ridge built over us with warm and humid conditions currently over us. Lots of other things to talk about. So let's get started on the issues that we're going to address today. Our presenter this month is Stuart Foster, who is the state climatologist for Kentucky at Western Kentucky University. Stuart, go ahead and let's get rolling.
Thank you, Dennis. I appreciate that introduction, and again would like to welcome everyone to the July webinar. It has certainly been an interesting start to the year here across the region, and trying to get my, there we go, trying to get my slides to advance. So we've got a good bit to talk about today. A little bit of general information. If you've been on these calls, you've certainly seen some of these header slides. But it's important to note that this effort reflects a collaboration among a lot of partners here in the region, and I must say that I'm impressed with the amount of teamwork among my fellow state climatologists and all of our regional and national partners with NOAA and USDA and such on these webinars. Our next webinar, looking ahead to August, will be on August 15th, and Aaron Wilson with the State Climate Office of Ohio will be the presenter for that one. And you can find archives of past webinars available at some various locations there. A few pictures just to set the context before we get started. Again, a very, very interesting year to date and past month and such across the central region. And of course, it's a very large region, so there's quite a variety of situations in different areas. But I think a key theme from the very wet conditions that we had earlier this year and relating to agriculture is that we have a lot of areas where crops, farmers were not able to get out in their fields and be able to resume with the normal schedule of field operations and planting. And so there are some areas where crops and corn in particular were planted relatively early on schedule, but many areas where planting was delayed greatly and in some cases did not occur at all. So when we're looking at impacts and so forth as we go through today's call, it's important to keep that in context. So the agenda for today, we'll talk about current conditions, climate conditions in historical context. We'll take a look at some impacts that we've been tracking in many cases now for some time, and also look ahead a little bit at some of the concerns going forward as to what might develop in the way of impacts as we move through the summer into the fall. We'll get to climate outlooks, certainly a key reason that we're doing this today, as we've got the release of the new monthly and seasonal outlooks from the Climate Prediction Center. And then at the end, we'll have time for some questions and answers and any further discussion. So providing a little bit of context, instead of starting right with the last month, I wanted to look at a rolling 12-month perspective from the National Centers for Environmental Information. We've got the statewide average temperature ranks on the left and the statewide precipitation ranks on the right. And you can see on the left map that temperatures have been much above average in the eastern part of the U.S. And eastern part of the central region, while much of the plains region has been well below normal in terms of temperature. So depending on what portion of the region you're in, you see some very different things in terms of temperatures over the last 12 months. With the perspective on precipitation, the story's a little bit different. There's a little more consistency over much of the region, and many states there, from Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky, and the eastern part of the region to Kansas and Nebraska in the central part of the central region, setting records in terms of 12-month precipitation totals, and other states that are very, very close to record levels. So just a remarkably wet period over the last 12 months. And many of you are aware that it's not just the last 12 months, but if we were to look at a time series going back to the late 1800s, it's just a remarkably wet period over the last decade or so over much of the region. If we look at the 3-month maps, so a little bit shorter window here, the temperature and precipitation patterns look fairly similar. Again, the colder temperatures in the central part of the country and warmer temperatures toward the coasts. And likewise, if you focus in on the central region, you've got the warmer conditions in the eastern portion there. And then precipitation, again, not record wetness, but many states, especially over the southern tier of the central region, have been much above normal in terms of precipitation for the last 3 months. And elsewhere, only North Dakota comes in at below average during that period, and that reflects a continuation, again, of a pattern there of drier conditions in that northern tier. Now, if we look just at the past month, we see that this map shows a little more of a deviation from that longer term pattern. Average temperature ranks, there's really not much that's interesting there. We're near average to maybe just a hair below average in some places, but temperature is basically not too much of a story over the last month. But it's in the context of cooler than normal conditions over much of the region up to that point. And then statewide precipitation ranks, again, if you look at Ohio and Kentucky, among the wettest months on record. In the eastern portion of the central region, as you get farther west, we get into near average precipitation, but the Dakotas trailing a little bit in terms of below average precipitation in terms of just looking at statewide ranks. And of course, depending on where you're located within a state, you might see a very different picture. And we'll try to get at that here shortly. Now looking at average temperature departure from mean temperature, this is a product out of the Midwestern Regional Climate Center, and we're interpolating then temperatures to get a little bit more resolution, but you see that pattern of average temperatures being warmer in the eastern portion of the region, anywhere from 3 to 4 degrees above normal in Ohio, to cooler than normal in the eastern or the western portion of the region, as much as 4 or 5 degrees below normal in terms of the average temperature in Colorado and Montana. This slide looks at not the average daily temperature, but the average maximum temperatures on the left, and then on the right, the average minimum temperatures. And again, we're looking at departure from the long-term average. So if you look at those, the big picture of it is that the pattern is similar, that the warmer conditions are in the east and cooler in the west. But you'll note that the departures for the high temperatures, the average high temperatures, while we're above normal in the eastern portion of the region, we're not, those temperatures are not as high there as compared to the average minimum temperatures. The average minimum temperatures have been much warmer than normal. So we've seen, as you note on the right side, areas of Ohio and some of Kentucky and Indiana that have been as much as 4, 5 or more degrees above normal. So I've got something that's caught on my screen here, so I apologize for that. And again, so the range of temperatures is a little bit depressed. The maximum temperatures not quite as warm as the lower minimum temperatures, and that's consistent with the amount of rainfall, cloud cover, the amount of moisture that's in the environment in general. Now we move on to look at precipitation, and I've put a lot on this slide. I've got 3 maps, so let's take a quick look at what we've got here. In the top, we're looking at the last 30 days. On the upper right, we're looking at the past 90 days, so that's going back to mid-April. And then in the lower right, we're looking at the year-to-date precipitation. So if you look at the 2 on the right-hand side, they show a fairly similar pattern, and that is a pattern that, with the exception of the northern tier of North Dakota, parts of Minnesota, maybe a little bit of Montana, most of the region has experienced precipitation that is well above what would be average for the region. So lots of greens in there that are anywhere from 125% to 175% of mean precipitation or long-term mean precipitation. And keep in mind that when you're looking at year-to-date totals, now we're looking at over 6 months of data. So getting a total that's 150% above normal or above average is that's a lot of extra rainfall when you're looking at that period of time. When you're looking at a 3-month period, those percentages reach as high as 200% above normal in portions of the region there, South Dakota and Kansas. And again, much of the region above normal or above mean in terms of accumulated precipitation. And then if we look at the last 30 days, what you note there is that there is some shift in the pattern. We've got an area that's centered on Iowa and extends into Illinois, Indiana, gets some of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, where it started to dry out. And then if you drop to western Kansas and eastern Colorado, you see some areas of dryness that have been developing, where they're only 50, 75% of normal precipitation. But again, very heavy precipitation with amounts that are 200 to even 300% of normal amounts over significant portions of the central region.
Hey, Stuart, can I interrupt for just 1 second? I forgot to mention to people, if you do have any questions along the way, please do type them in the chat box, and we will address those if we can along the way, or we will take care of them at the end. Sorry to interrupt, Stuart.
Yeah, no problem, Dennis. Kind of move on to looking at soil moisture, and these are shown in millimeters. So if you want to convert that to inches, to think of it in those terms, you need to take those numbers and divide them by about 25 to put them in perspective. I think the key thing here is that at the top, you're looking at a map of the soil moisture anomaly. So again, how we deviate from a long-term average, and you see a lot of greens, in some cases very dark greens, that show very wet conditions in soil. But if you look at the bottom, we're looking at the change in the soil moisture anomaly basically over the last 2 to 3 weeks. And there you start to see some oranges and reds pop up. And that's actually important to take note of, because what it's telling us is that even though there's quite a bit of moisture in the system, quite a bit of soil moisture, we have seen a good bit of drying occurring recently in areas that have not received a lot of precipitation. Again, thinking back to the maps that we just looked at, areas that were drier, and we get into the summertime conditions with higher temperatures, and we see evapotranspiration occurring at a higher rate. And so we've got some drying of the upper layers of the soil, not so much lower levels, quite a bit of moisture there, but the top levels of soil are starting to dry out in some areas. And that's something important to keep in mind as we go on here. This map is quite colorful composition. The Vegetation Health Index, so we're basing this on remote sensing data, and it really kind of highlights some of what we've seen reflected in the temperature, or excuse me, the precipitation maps up to this point. Here the blue values represent much healthier vegetation, and the reds and oranges vegetation that is under more stress. And in this case, areas that where planting happened late and crops have been under stress in terms of very poor soil conditions, poor environmental conditions there. But again, you see a lot of purple and areas where conditions are very, very good. And moving on now to looking at stream flows and what's happened to all of that water that's fallen. And we can see that we've got a large patch of blue in parts of the Missouri Basin. And otherwise, we're looking at stream flows, 7-day average stream flows that are much above normal in portions of the region, and otherwise areas that are above normal or near normal. Very, very little area where we have below normal stream flows, although you can pick those out here and there. And then moving on to looking at current flooding conditions, this map has not changed a whole lot for a while, because we've had river systems that have been in a state of flood for months at this point. So water levels have generally been receding, but we still have flooding conditions, and it really highlights the challenges that are being faced, certainly our Army Corps of Engineers partners and such, but how do we basically, how do we get that water out of the region and down the Mississippi River system? So a big challenge at this point. So many times we're very concerned about retaining water and holding water back, and now it's more of how can we get rid of that water, how can we push it on downstream. A couple maps here, or graphs, that we typically put in the presentations, looking at snowpack at Fort Peck, above Fort Peck, and then from Fort Peck to Garrison in the Missouri River Basin. And in both cases, the snowpack has melted, so it's completely gone for the season. And again, in this case, that's probably good news at this point, that the water that would be contributed to the river is already in the system per se. And then looking at the same graphs for the North and South Platte River Basin, you can see that snowpacks this past year were slightly above normal, or certainly in good shape, but they've melted now, and so same kind of situation. That water's already been released into the system. Okay. Now a shift from the western portion of the central region over to the eastern portion and look at the Great Lakes water levels. Last month's webinar, this was also a focus, but we're looking at graphs here from the Army Corps of Engineers, and let's take just a moment to look at what these graphs are showing for us. So if you look at the legend there at the top, you can see the red line that starts across from January is showing the 2019, the current year and current situation in terms of water levels on the different lakes. The blue line across there is 2018, which was a very wet year. And then otherwise, if you look at the pink dots there, those are the long-term average monthly mean lake levels, and the hashed lines above and below there represent the record high and record low monthly mean lake levels. So you can kind of pick whichever lake you want to look at, but in all cases they're running well above normal. In the case of Lake Superior, Lake St. Clair, Lake Erie, and Lake Ontario, they all set record high water levels for the month of June. In some cases, record levels regardless of the month. And those levels generally in the range of 31 to 35 inches above the monthly averages. Lake Michigan Huron almost broke its record for the month of June, came within an inch of that, and is running about 14 inches above average. So record high, historically significant lake levels expected to start receding, but will remain well above average for some time. And that will pose some challenges. It already has posed some challenges. So we'll kind of transition a little bit here to talk about some impacts while we're focused on the Great Lakes. And again, some of these came up last month in the call. Coastal erosion has been an issue, and in some cases then damage to property and infrastructure, economic impacts to tourism in terms of boating and such on the lakes and fishing. And while lake levels are projected to drop, wind-related flooding concerns will remain. So at this point, it doesn't even take a strong storm and strong winds to create flooding, but that's likely to continue to be a concern well into the fall. And of course, you get into the fall months and you can get some much stronger storms and higher winds there on the lake. So that concern is not going to go away anytime soon. In addition, with regard to the lakes and Lake Erie in particular, and focusing there on the western portion of the lake, the Maumee River emptying into Lake Erie, recently released a forecast for harmful algae bloom to develop on the western portion of Lake Erie. And you can see the forecast there on the upper left on the graph, forecasting a target of about 7.5 on the scale that shows in this case that would put this year's bloom as one of the highest there on the period of record that goes back to 2002. So certainly not likely at this point to be the worst, but a very significant concern this year. And again, a very high level of runoff into the lake with all the precipitation that's occurred in that region. So moving on to drought, that's a different word. We haven't talked about dry conditions yet. So when you look at the drought monitor, I think we're generally aware that, again, we're in a remarkable period for the lack of drought across the United States in general, and focusing on the central region, only very small areas in North Dakota, kind of that northern tier, a little bit in Minnesota and the upper peninsula of Michigan, a little bit more in western Montana. But again, none of that in the extreme or exceptional category. Some of that has been persistent. Otherwise, when you look across the region, there's certainly no indication of drought conditions at this time. And looking at this map, we can look at the change in drought status over the last month. The greens are what we like to see there, that conditions have improved there along much of the northern tier, a 1 to 2 class improvement of drought conditions. So again, more precipitation over this last 30 days for a good portion of that region. Again, go back to that map, we had 2 to as much as 300% of what we would expect for the last month. So it's made an impact. Okay. Now let's move from looking at climate conditions across the region to talking about some impacts, and most of the focus here is going to be on agriculture. We'll start looking at corn, and we've got a map here on the left that shows the percent of corn that is silking and how that compares to the 5-year average. And you can look from state to state, but basically what we see is that silking is occurring, but it's much behind schedule. Again, in reflecting in many cases the late planting dates combined with cooler temperatures across much of the region there put us well behind where we would like to be at this time of year. And on the right, looking then at the condition of corn, the percent of corn that is in the good to excellent category, and again how that compares to last year, we see a lot of negative numbers in parentheses there, that corn conditions are much poorer than they were last year. Within the region, there are some areas, particularly in the Dakotas and Nebraska and Kentucky, where corn is in pretty good condition overall, but much of the region where it's just much poorer than what would be desirable from a farmer's perspective. So we've got some challenges there on corn. Again, the late planting date's a big concern. The wet conditions have resulted in poorly developed root systems in many areas, and that's critical because it makes plants particularly vulnerable to rapid depletion of near surface soil temperature. So there's concern, and we'll mention this later, concern about flash drought. Not that there's a particularly high likelihood, but simply that crops would be very vulnerable to it if it were to develop. Also some concern with corn because of the late planting of an elevated risk of frost damage. If we were to have an early frost this year, or perhaps even about normal, it could be problematic for some of that late planted corn, and especially if temperatures remain cool over portions of the region. Soybeans, again, similar kind of concerns about planting and field conditions. If you look at percent blooming, we're well behind normal in terms of where we would like to be. And soybean conditions are percent that are good and excellent, peak out at about 72% in Kentucky, 71% in Nebraska, but otherwise we're in the 60s or down to the 30s in Ohio and Indiana. So both corn and soybeans, Ohio, Indiana, really facing difficult situation this year with all the wet conditions that they experienced. So in the case of soybeans, the late planted beans are not canopying, and this is raising concerns about issues with weeds, and of course with all the moisture, weeds, that's a good environment for weed development. A freeze at the in the fall is less of a concern with beans compared with corn going forward. Winter wheat, The harvest is well underway, and you can see as you go from south to north there's more work to do in the as you move north out of Kansas, and in the east it's largely complete. Colorado is in process, has a ways to go in terms of harvest there, and spring wheat progress. Again, a little bit behind normal due to wet conditions, and generally good condition, but just a little bit behind normal in terms of heading of spring wheat at this point. So again, regardless of what crop we're looking at, we're seeing some of the same kinds of concerns. Pasture and range conditions, maybe a little bit different story with all the precipitation. Those conditions are generally good over much of the region, with exceptions in Ohio, in much of the eastern Midwest, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois. And when you look at that eastern portion of the region, that's a concern this year because there were lots of areas last year that did not have good hay crop, again, because of the very wet conditions last year. And so there's a need for forage there, particularly in that region. And currently things are a bit of a concern. It's presenting farmers with decisions to be made about late planting, and perhaps even some talk of planting corn and beans and using those as forage as opposed to expecting them to grow to maturity. So otherwise, as you get over across the plains, Great Plains, conditions are generally very good, and we have a high percentage of pasture and range that is in very, very good condition and much better than it was last year. So there's a positive there to look at. Now, a few slides to just kind of highlight and again focus in on some of the concerns that we've kind of talked about on the last few slides. Upper left, we've got a slide of a field in North Dakota, soybeans that are being stunted by wet field conditions, and a quote there from North Dakota State University plant scientist. Even if flooding does not kill the plant, it may have a long-term negative impact on crop performance. In the upper right, we just mentioned that pasture and rangeland is in very good conditions, but there is a downside to that. Yellow clover is doing particularly well, and the mix of grasses and plants and such in pasture becomes a concern if they get too much clover and such. So that slide there provided by Laura Edwards, the previous one there from Adnan Accuse. And then on the bottom slide, this photo was passed along by Al Dutcher there in Nebraska, and highlights an extreme precipitation event over the early July, 10 to 15 inches of rain that impacted communities along the Platte and Republican rivers. The photo is of the Harlan County Reservoir reaching record levels, and again highlights the problem that there's so much water that effectively needs to be evacuated, moved out of the region, and it's very, very difficult to do that right now. So, and it also highlights that the impacts extend beyond agriculture to communities. So this flooding has produced extensive damage earlier this spring and continues to, in some cases, impacting areas that were recovering from floods previously. And finally, that slide again highlights, again, I don't mean to beat a dead horse, but with the high levels of soil moisture that we're observing, it does not take an incredibly heavy rain event to produce flooding and flash flooding events. So we're just at a heightened level of vulnerability to extreme precipitation events pretty much throughout the region. Okay. And having said that, looking at the 7-day quantitative precipitation forecast, you can take a look there, and Fortunately, most of the reds and oranges are off to the east, and with the exception of some areas in Iowa and Wisconsin and Minnesota, and those areas probably would be happy to get some of that rain if it materializes. Otherwise, we see over the short term a bit of drying out over part of the plains. 8 to 14 day outlook. Currently, well, a lot of us are dealing with excessive heat across the region, but that is going to be short-lived. The 8 to 14 day outlook showing the expectation of much below normal temperatures, very high probability, I should say, of much below normal temperatures dipping down into the southeastern U.S. and reflecting the invasion by a cold front dipping much farther south than would be typical this time of year. So should bring some cooler temperatures and some much drier air. And certainly speaking from the context of Kentucky, I can tell you that some dry air and lower dew points would be very welcome at this point. On the right-hand side, we're looking at precipitation probability, and in conjunction with that cool air mass, below normal precipitation expected over the next 8 to 14 day period. So again, I think a lot of us are looking forward to that, with the exception of maybe the low temperatures being a concern about ongoing crop development. Before we get into the monthly and seasonal outlooks, I think it's worth noting, give an update on the ENSO forecast. As you know, we've been in a relatively mild El Nino event for the past several months. It took a while to get its act together in terms of when it formed, and it's persisted in a fairly weak state for the last several months. Expected to continue to weaken over the next couple months. And you look at the probabilistic forecast in the upper left there, you'll see that the reds are the El Nino forecast probability for the June, July, August period there on the left, and then progressing as you go to the right through the fall season. And you can see that the red bars get a little bit shorter, and the gray bars representing a neutral forecast probability get a little bit higher. And so the odds are that we're going to shift from El Nino back to neutral status. But at the same time, as you continue to look through there to the winter, you start to see some increasing heights on the red bars that maybe El Nino is going to come back, those conditions. So anyway, it's been a relatively weak event, but it certainly has had some impacts in terms of our weather conditions across the region. Okay. So the monthly outlook for August, if we look at temperature probability on the left, we continue to expect some cooler temperatures there in the western and northern part of the plains region. The expectation is that we're going to see some ridging develop in the western U.S. and the Alaska region, and so some higher temperatures and above normal temperatures in that region, and then this trough developing from the central, east central U.S. That'll bring some comparatively cooler temperatures than what's expected on other parts of the country, continuing to be warmer than normal expectation on the East Coast. So the EC there, equal chances for much of the plains as to whether we're above, below, or near normal temperature. So on the right-hand side, we're looking at precipitation. And again, we continue to see a slightly elevated probability for above normal precipitation centered over the Great Plains region. And again, that's the outlook for the month of August. If we stretch that out through the 3-month period, August, September, October, get us moving into the fall, You can see temperature-wise, equal chances dominate most of the region. But outside of that, when we look around the country, southwest, expecting an elevated probability of above normal temperatures, and then really around the coastal areas from the south to the northeast, expecting above normal temperatures to be more likely, the more likely scenario. And then the precipitation map looks like it hasn't changed much from the 1 month map. Looks like basically the same area with a slightly enhanced likelihood of above normal precipitation. So what does that mean in terms of drought and wildfire? Well, again, the seasonal drought outlook largely void of color across the country. But some drought to persist in the northwest. Otherwise, what little drought there is in the central region, likely to see some improvement there in the northern plains, consistent with that outlook for above normal precipitation. And then wildfires, had gotten some notes that conditions starting to dry out in Colorado. There might be some concern for a little bit of an increase in the fire danger, but really all across the region, very, very low levels to normal levels of fire potential out in terms of the outlook for August. So not something that's a big concern at this point. Okay. So summarizing all of this, again, the effects of extraordinarily wet conditions across much of the region continue to be felt. So essentially, for the future here, as we look to the next month, look at that outlook, I think we're saying that regardless of what climatic conditions turn out to be, we're going to continue to see the effects of what we've experienced up to this point, and how those climatic conditions play out will be particularly critical for some of those late planted crops. Elevated soil moisture and stream flows, vulnerability to flooding and flash flooding remains. And again, that's not to say that there's a prediction that we're going to experience that, but just that if we do get those heavy rains, we're likely to see flooding conditions raise their head pretty quickly. In the midst of all of that, there are some pockets of dryness that are becoming noticeable in some areas. The improvement in drought conditions we commented on have been evident across the northern tier, but folks from Michigan across to Iowa, northern Indiana have expressed some concern, starting to notice drying conditions there. And again, with poorly developed root systems in corn and such, there's concern about the impacts that could have. El Nino likely to diminish with a return to neutral conditions likely, but at the same time, there's some hint that it may come back over the winter months. And then finally, wet conditions are favored over the next month and season, particularly in the Great Plains, but crops at the same time have a heightened vulnerability to flash drought developing. So quite a combination of things, and when we look at some of those summary comments, there are things there that don't seem to fit together on the same page, but in a very unusual period, they do. So with that, Dennis, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Very good job as usual. We appreciate the comments. I also do want to just one more thank you. In addition to Stuart, we have Chris Foltz from the National Weather Service, who is running the background technology for us and is working things from that end. Okay, at this point, what we'll do is we'll start dealing with some of the questions, and we have those typed in, and we'll try to deal with those as we go along here. And then if you haven't typed it in, if you need to ask a question or need to would like to verbally make a comment, raise your hand, and Chris will recognize you, and we'll go from there. We have some rolling in so far, Stuart. Starting with the first one was from Benjamin Diamond about El Nino impacts over the region, or the El Nino fading. Do you want to address that at all?
Well, at this point, what we've seen in terms of precipitation and temperature has been, broadly consistent with an El Nino kind of pattern up to this point. But I think the key right now is that the conditions that we've seen up to this point have kind of set the table as to what impacts might develop going forward, regardless of whether those El Nino conditions dissipate or not, and we get back to more nearer normal types of conditions. So I don't know if you want to add anything or not.
I would agree that the El Nino was noted from the Climate Prediction Center influencing the early season outlooks. El Ninos across a good portion of our area tend to be a little cooler, lean a little bit cooler and a little bit wetter for the chances during the summertime. That combined with another oscillation called the Arctic oscillation, which we won't dive into, have been a player so far this year. With the El Nino starting to fade, that is impacting what we're seeing in the outlooks and may affect us from here on out during the growing season. So those have been the main impacts. And for this growing season would have been a fairly good growing season so far if it had not been so wet early on that we delayed our planting and the delayed crop situation. So there's that one. Okay. And then there was a follow-up. If you want to touch this, Stuart, will the fading El Nino lead to an early frost or freeze?
Yeah, I think that's anybody's guess. So those types of events are typically short-term, and we're kind of too far out to make a projection on that. But I think there has been some speculation by some folks about that possibility. But I'd be hesitant to go out on a limb on that.
And I would agree with him on that we're too far to be making any kind of indications. The overall trend towards first hard freezes is actually later across most of our region, so that's actually working in our favor at this point. We're just too far out to be able to say with much any kind of certainty what the chances are for any kind of an early event. So I think we're in pretty good shape that way. A couple comments on the flash drought side. Virgil Schmidt from Eastern Iowa noting he's getting quite a bit of rolling in corn. Nathan Mueller from Nebraska seeing flash drought conditions in east central Nebraska, cracks in the soil surface already 1 inch wide, leaves curling at 10 a.m., and soybeans growing slowly. And this is connected with another question that came up, and I'll address this one. Was the situation we're dealing with in this is we have crops that were planted frequently in wet conditions, in wet soils, and the question that came up was, why do wet conditions lead to poorly developed roots in soils? And basically the situation when you plant into wetter soils, oftentimes you'll get compaction, you'll compact the soil, and that limits the ability for roots to develop into the soil. But probably even bigger this year, when you have saturated soils, roots will not grow into saturated soils. One, they have access to the moisture they need starting growing, and then the joke is roots don't like wet feet for the most part, so they will not develop into saturated soil. So if you have a saturated soil further down or near the surface, that limits your root development. So what you have is, instead of crops rooting down several, up to 5 or 6 feet in cases. You do not have that this year. So you'll have plants that have roots that are maybe only, depends on the situation, but might only be 2 or 3 feet deep at most. So when they start to dry out and get into hot conditions like this, they dry that soil out and remove all the moisture. Then you leave them open to stressful conditions like we're seeing right now with the corn leaf rolling and the cracked soils, those sorts of things. So, okay. There was also a question about why don't late beans canopy. Basically, the late soybeans are developing more slowly, and if they're growing more slowly, that does not allow them to leaf out as quickly and to grow together to cover up the interrow between the different rows. And when that is open, that allows weed growth in those areas more readily. If you've got soybeans covering that, the weeds don't grow in that more readily. Okay, question from Bryce Anderson. Thoughts on the current heat wave being the only such event this summer? Stuart, do you want to touch on that at all?
Well, looking at the outlook that was just released today, it certainly suggests we are seeing expecting to see a transition in the general circulation here later in the month, and so that would seemingly reduce the likelihood of that. But again, I wouldn't go out on a limb to suggest that it's not going to happen. But I think what the outlook does hint at, though, is that we again are going to see a shift. So we get into a different kind of mode of circulation. If somebody wants to interpret that as a lower likelihood of another event, perhaps, but again, we've got a long way to go yet this summer.
And I would agree with that. At least in the near term, we don't have the likelihood. Month of August is still we're susceptible to extreme heat in August, but climatologically we do start falling off at that point. So let's see. Another comment from Virgil Schmidt. Some plant breeders have reminded me that corn is not bred to be planted late and in poor conditions. So that's another one of those issues of why crops are not doing well. Late planted crops just don't have enough time to grow properly and to go through their phenological stages the right way. And that's why we have serious concerns about them reaching full maturity by the time the frost and freeze goes around. And that's why there's great concern, even if we don't have any kind of an early freeze, unless things go right, even a near average freeze at this point would probably do some damage, either leading to yield loss, or maybe at least some yield quality issues. One other comment that came out was mentioned to me yesterday was a concern about a lack of seed corn and possibly even beans next year, because those are also being grown at this point. And if conditions don't go well, there may not be enough seed corn grown. So, and I guess related, there was one other question about the chance for early freeze or average first freeze. I think we've kind of addressed that already. Chris, are there any other comments, or does anybody have a hand raised that we need to address with anything?
Nope, nothing else so far.
Okay. I would compliment Stuart and agree with Stuart on the overall wetness situation of, if especially in places that continue to get rainfall, not large rainfalls can still produce minor flooding issues because of the saturated soils that we are dealing with at this point. So these are going to be issues that are going to continue to go along with. One other comment from, I'm not sure who this is from. Soils with lower carbon content are more likely to have crops growing on them, which may exhibit drought conditions before a meteorological drought is in effect. High carbon soils can make more water available So basically your better soils can survive through these conditions better. Though there was another comment from Nathan Mueller that even some of the better soils are showing some of the issues right now because of the combination of extreme heat and dry conditions. So I think we have covered all the main issues. Let me check back here real quickly and make sure. Oh, did I? Okay, there was one comment about sweet clover. There was a question about what the sweet clover issue, and we actually got a chime in from Miranda Meehan in North Dakota saying that sweet clover is a biennial, so it's not necessarily just the wet conditions this year. This probably would have been a better year for sweet clover anyway, but when you combine that with the wet conditions, that probably may have led to something like that. And then Diane Mann Klager asking, can the level of sweet clover be characterized high or low year? I think the impression is that this has been a pretty high year. Sweet clover is not my main background area. I don't know, Miranda, if you're still around, if you can chime in and want to chime in, or anyone else. And maybe if the additional sweet clover, what kind of issues that would bring along with it.
Hey, Dennis, this is Chris. I did go ahead and unmute Miranda, so if she's on and she has something to speak about, she can.
Okay. It's probably site specific. If it's already in your range or pasture land, that you're going to see more of it because it's not just going to show up because of the precipitation or rain. I guess the only potential is if you would hay it and the hay got moldy, that it could potentially be toxic. But that would be the only issue I see. And I mean, it might not be consumed as evenly as you'd like, depending on timing of use of it. But that's really it. It happens in North Dakota. We see it every couple of years. We see it regardless of how much precipitation the site has, that we see a whole bunch of it. And that's what the entire site looks like, since it's so much taller than the other species out there.
And then on the fire danger side related to that, can you address that at all, Miranda?
Can you repeat that?
On the fire danger side, does that change the fire danger side if and when things start to dry down?
Oh, I'm not sure about that. I don't know if there's any data to support that. It's really stocky. There isn't a lot of leaf tissue to it. So, but I don't know of any data that supports that one way or the other.
Okay. I've seen on social media some comments about maybe concern on fire danger related to sweet clover. So I don't know so I can't speak to that specifically or not. So, okay. Thank you, Miranda. Okay. Are there any last questions anyone wants to chime in with? We'll give you an opportunity to type those in if you want to. Once again, we'll thank Stuart Foster from the Kentucky State Climate Office for a fine job once again. We appreciate that. Looking forward to next month. We'll have Aaron Wilson from the Ohio State Climate Office at The Ohio State University. Looking forward to that. And not seeing any other chime-ins on questions, so thank you all for attending. We appreciate your input and questions, and we'll look forward to talking to you again next month.